Welcome to the Egg Whisperer Show, a program exclusively designed to promote reproductive health awareness and discuss fertility preservation options. Here is your host, the Harvard-educated fertility specialist, Dr. Amy.
She's known as the Egg Whisperer.
Fertility expert Dr. Amy Vazadeh.
And you have yet another success story
Just launched by an East Bay fertility doctor.
Welcome to the Egg Whisperer Show. I have my dear friend, Dr. Carol Burton, on today to talk about her new book. Hi, Carol. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, I love talking to you. You're just, every time you come on, I feel like I learn so much, our audience learns so much, and you just published a new book, The Thin Pink Line, Regulating Reproduction. Tell us about your book.
So my book, The Thin Pink Line, Regulating Reproduction, is all about sort of the history of the regulation of reproduction, modern day controversial topics in obstetrics and gynecology and fertility medicine, and kind of like a cutting edge look at where we're going in the future.
And you kind of are the boss on that. I mean, you have your PhD in animal cloning from University of Connecticut. You did your fellowship at the Burnham Institute focusing on human embryonic stem cell research. And you have active research interests that span from reproductive biology, basic embryology, to cutting edge artificial intelligence applications for IVF. And I don't know that everyone knows this, but they should, that you're also the founder of ARTCompass, which is a free open source image-based embryology survey tool. Tell us a little bit about that tool too.
Okay, great. Oh my gosh, where should I start? Okay, so let's start with the artificial intelligence for reproduction. So artificial intelligence has been huge in different industries for many years now, right? So Google, Siri, Amazon, every suggestion we get is a prediction based on millions of data points of consumers' previous data. Everything we like on Facebook, everything we get served, almost everything in our world now is sort of a product of algorithms and artificial intelligence. And probably like at least 20, if not 30 years ago, people started to get the idea maybe artificial intelligence algorithms can actually help infertility patients. But a lot of the other technologies hadn't caught up yet. So we had to have, for example, the development of time-lapse microscopy incubation for embryos in order to get the kind of data that artificial intelligence systems need to make their predictions. So a lot of the AI systems that have been developed so far in reproduction have not yet been commercialized. They're not very widely applied in IVF labs. And that's a huge problem because, for our patients, up to 2/3 of IVF cycles, by some estimates, are still failing infertility patients. There's a lot of, very intractable infertility cases that can't be solved and different kinds of problems in reproductive medicine. So repeated implantation failure, for example, repeated miscarriages, just the genetics and PGT, whether that is having the kind of impact that we want it to have on embryo selection. So getting patients pregnant quickly with a single, euploid normal embryo that has a very high chance of success. And basically, reducing embryo wastage, reducing treatment dropout and burnout and treatment fatigue, right? There are all kinds of issues in reproductive medicine and infertility that artificial intelligence could be applied against. Now, that being said, I and others have analyzed the publications that have been available for artificial intelligence in reproductive medicine. The data that they've used, some of the best labs in the world are publishing these data. The studies have been, the algorithms and the studies are published with 10,000 data points maximum. So if you compare that to Google or Amazon's billions and billions of data points, you can see why their AI systems are so powerful at guiding our lives, right? And we want that kind of power in infertility, in reproduction, but we can't get it because the way that data is recorded, accessed, and kept for artificial intelligence systems, we are still mostly using paper in the labs. So we record everything about our patients' cycles on a piece of paper, and it gets filed away at the end of the cycle. Sometimes it gets transcribed into the EMR that ports over to the clinical side. But on the lab side, the data is so much richer than what we put into the EMR. Usually we update the physician 5 blastocysts frozen, 3 of them are normal, these are the grades. It's a small fraction of the actual data that gets collected during an IVF cycle. So about 5 years ago, I became pregnant with my own miracle baby, and I was in research for 15 years. So all those things that you mentioned, like cloning cows and doing human embryonic stem cell research, all of those things, whether I knew it or not, were kind of preparing me for my new career in clinical embryology. So when I became pregnant with my own miracle baby, I had a very strong feeling like I needed to have a career that was more fulfilling, that I would actually be able to leave my house every day and spend my life doing. And I wanted to kind of get out of research and get out of the, grant to grant, kind of like almost like paycheck to paycheck lifestyle, and get into something that was more stable for my family financially and also more fulfilling for me, that, really we work so hard, and making other people have their families and helping in that way, and being able to apply everything I know about science, from embryology, vitrification and genetics, molecular biology, reproductive physiology, all those things in the lab every day, is really what drives me. So I started looking at artificial intelligence systems for reproduction. And what I very quickly realized is the reason why this data doesn't really exist to make these AI systems is because it's stuck in the lab. So ARTCompass is all about getting that data out of labs and sort of redefining the way that reproductive lab data can be accessed by AI systems. And what that means kind of every day for physicians, for patients, and for embryologists is that it's a software system that's all of the IVF lab data can get recorded in. And the physician kind of gets insight into what's happening in the cycle from the IVF lab point of view. The patient can see their embryos, images of their embryos, know exactly what's in their cryostorage inventory, how many embryos they have left, what the percentage of mature eggs retrieved per cycle is. And this kind of gets to the heart sometimes of, what do we want our patients who know the most about their own cycles and their own bodies to know? Because patients now can have kind of unprecedented insight, which can be helpful if they have multiple cycles, they're switching doctors, they're, perhaps they've switched clinics, and they've had kind of, multiple IVF cycles. And having all of that data about themselves in one place, I think can be very empowering just right off the bat, that as the first layer. And then the second layer is, how can we apply artificial intelligence systems to this data to make future IVF cycles more successful?
What I tell patients almost daily is, the more you know, the better things will go. And I come up with all these mnemonics, like embryo diamonds, like you have to know what day your embryo is frozen, the implantation rate per embryo, each letter has something that goes along with it. But basically ARTCompass kind of would replace that. So patients could have that information and not say ever, why didn't anyone tell me that I could have that information about myself after 5 cycles? I mean,
Absolutely.
that just blows my mind, that people just don't know that this information is out there about them, that the lab knows it, but it may not have been communicated with them. Maybe it was, and they just didn't have enough time to absorb it.
And from the patient point of view, that definitely happens, right? You call to give the results. Sometimes they're upsetting. They're not what you expected. They're not what you'd hoped for. You're emotional. Somebody tells you a lot of information that's highly specialized over the phone or by email. And then you end up having multiple emails, maybe multiple phone calls. And yeah, information can be everywhere. And it's funny because a lot of times it's on the patient to track their own information, right? But this should be coming from the lab. So there's another app out there that I love, and I'll just briefly mention it because my team actually worked on the app to help build it, and I'm a huge supporter of the MB app. But it approaches this problem from the opposite perspective. The patient puts their own data in about their cycles and their embryos and their embryo images instead of the lab doing it. And really that's because IVF labs haven't started implementing these digital tools yet.
Wow.
Yeah.
So MEMBIE, is that how you
Yes.
spell it?
Yes.
Okay. Well, they reached out to me and I thought it was you. I'm like, Carol, we're already talking. Okay. Well, now I'm
Well,
okay. So now I know the connection there. That's why it felt like it was. So I want to talk more about your book. I mean, you describe it as focused on exploring the history to present day drivers of access, structural inequality, and quality of care issues in reproduction. And then there's this term, intersectionalist, in its approach. And what does that mean for people who don't necessarily know what that means?
Yeah, so I'm so glad you asked that. So intersectionality is kind of like let me give you an example. So the recognition that we're all women and women make less than men, but different groups of women are making even less. That is intersectionality. It's the realization that not all people can be grouped together, and there are different layers to each problem that impacts different vulnerable groups in different ways. So a lot of times we first start off by talking about what is the general problem, but then start breaking it down into how does that more specifically impact vulnerable groups. So that could be LGBTQ, that could be anybody who's been historically oppressed. It could be, Black, Latino, all kinds of different things. Trans, we talk about a lot in the book, and those kind of issues. So
let's break down some of those. I mean, access to care is something that's been in the forefront of the news, especially during the pandemic, as we see populations of color having less access to medical care than white populations. How does that affect people of color in fertility medicine?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So it really does impact people in a lot of ways. Number one, getting into the pipeline, having access to the care itself, and just having the diagnosis that brings you into the infertility clinic sooner. So it's longer time to diagnosis, and that can often make problems worse because they've been going on for years, a disease process. And also, as you age, of course, your eggs are getting older, and all of the regular problems of aging are happening for infertility. But then it's also, yes, it's cultural, who's encouraged to access infertility care, who's encouraged to go to the doctor. Do they have a doctor they feel like they're comfortable going to? And talking about some of these things that can be highly stigmatized. And then, of course, when they do access infertility care, the rates are lower for the three major minority groups, Asian, Latino, and Black. And not only are the IVF rates lower in general, but the miscarriage rate is higher. So the take-home live birth rate is going to be much lower. And, it's like I think about it sometimes when I look at the social media feed, for example, of an IVF clinic that's in a major metropolitan area. And I can see, just taking a quick glance at the first row of squares, that they're not representing all of the people who are in the city. And it makes me think to myself, who really is accessing this care?
And I know we'll talk a little bit more about how we address that, but I also want to talk about the structural inequality as an issue that you also talk about in this book. What do you mean by this, and how does it impact patients?
Yeah, so the structural inequality is sort of those inequalities that are built into the system. And you oftentimes don't even know that they're there because they're so much a part of the system that, you don't know, for example, there's any other way. So one of the interviews that I did for the book was about fibroids, uterine fibroids. And a lot of times the go-to treatment for that immediately for Black people is often, let's remove the whole uterus, instead of offering different treatments that can preserve their fertility. So that's kind of one of the examples of where it's so structural that you don't even know when you're a patient that there are other choices, and you're sort of taking the advice of the physician, who may not look like you and may have their own implicit biases. Maybe they haven't even had a conversation with you about whether you're done building your family or not.
And then how about with pain management? I think that's something you address in the book as well. Are women of color less likely to have appropriate pain management offered to them?
Yes, and women in general are. So there's, when you survey physicians, they sometimes think that women are kind of inherently built to be able to handle pain because we go through childbirth. Or for any number of reasons, right? Like people might just think like, oh, women are so strong. Women are stronger than men. Men don't get sick very often, but when they do, it's like the man flu, right? They can't handle it, but women can. So therefore, I think, pain management is offered less frequently and not to the amount that it should be. So, and this is a case again of like intersectionality. So I have an example from my own traumatic induction, which led to an emergency C-section. And the male physician, very young male physician, did a very painful procedure on me where they inserted a Foley balloon into my cervix and then tried to, manually get my cervix to open up by slowly inflating the balloon and then pulling it out centimeter by centimeter through my cervix. And I was in so much pain. I mean, there was blood everywhere. Luckily, my husband wasn't in the room because it literally looked like a war zone. And, nobody mentioned pain management at all. And my vitals started by the morning time. The nurse or the doctor came in every hour and pulled it another centimeter. By the morning time, my blood pressure was sky high. I was in so much pain. Pain management was never offered to me until a female nurse busted in the morning. She's like, what is happening with this patient's vitals? Looking at everything and being like, you're in pain, and offered me some morphine, and I didn't even know it was a choice. I mean, it was just, it was horrible. And so then magnify that, multiply it by implicit bias, structural inequality. I've heard from many Black women who have been treated like they're seeking pain medication, like they're drug seeking, like it's drug seeking behavior. They're questioned much, much more. So then when the nurse came in and she said, oh, this patient needs pain medication. Do you want pain medication? And I was like, yes. I wasn't questioned, right? So I wasn't offered it, but I wasn't questioned. Nobody treated me poorly because I said, yes, I wanted it. And so I think those are things, examples of things that can happen. And I do mention in my book that there are some procedures that are routinely under medicated in reproduction. Hysteroscopy with biopsy can be one of those. So there's a whole society in the UK now that is doing some good work bringing light to this topic, because again, a lot of people think like, oh, the biopsy, it's just going to be a little snip, probably a lot of male doctors performing it, and it ends up being this, blinding, traumatic PTSD inducing pain in women.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's the hysteroscopy, it's the HSG, it's the DNC. I mean, the uterus is inside the body, it's an organ, it's a muscle, and if you're removing something from it, it can be quite traumatizing. And if it's done in an office setting without any anesthesia, guess what? you might not have a complete procedure. You might think you're having everything removed, but it's not being removed because you're awake. You might be in pain, moaning, moving a little bit. So your doctor might not be able to actually remove everything. And now you don't know that necessarily until you go back and then find out that the problem is still there. So I have a whole thing on, how I have a video actually on how to survive your HSG procedure. And I have it out there for people to realize that it's a painful procedure and people should be offered pain medication. And then it's your right to refuse and decline. But if you don't know, and I've heard things like, well, you expect to be in labor, like this is just practice for that. And I find that to be just quite patronizing and extremely rude and insulting. And we would never do that to a male patient, right? I mean, never. But we somehow think that it's okay and all right to do it to women.
I think about the pain management that's offered for TESI patients, where they're taking a biopsy essentially of the testicles, and it's so painful, but pretty much equivalent to what you're talking about. And they're offered pain management for days after their procedure. It's just so different, like so starkly different, right? I mean, I've heard people, also a lot of times they're saying, okay, take stronger pain management the day of, but then after that, you will only need Tylenol.
Yeah, I mean, even the egg retrieval procedure, I offer all my patients stronger pain medication than Tylenol and Advil. Only 5% of them will use it, like 95% of them won't. But at 2 a.m, if you're in severe pain, I don't want you running to the emergency room because you're having a hard time, sleeping and you're in pain. So a simple pain pill is not, is important for my patients to have from my perspective. So thank you for talking about that.
So finding a physician, this is how you can advocate for yourself as a patient. Finding a physician who looks like you or as close to you as possible.
It's hard to find someone with a nose as big as mine, I have to tell you that.
or as beautiful as you.
You also talk about quality of care as a point you address. And I know that you referenced that maternal health outcomes are worse today than they were 100 years ago. What is happening with this?
So first I want to say, by writing this book, I am trying to help do the work of educating and taking that burden off of the vulnerable populations who have been doing a lot of work in this space already. Not only do I mention a lot of the groups that are working in this space in the book, but I want to continue to lift them up. So the Shades of Blue project, the Earth app that's just come out now, the NAB, and there are many associations that are doing a lot of work, and we want to point to them first as the experts and center them. But secondarily to that, part of the reason for me writing this book was to help do some of the work of educating. And so I do have a whole chapter that addresses this. And so the easiest way that I can kind of bring this topic to light for people is I reference a lot of times the heart attack work that's been done for men and for cardiovascular disease. So we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that anger, anxiety, and feeling like you're not in control raises the risk of heart attack. Now, think about how many times a day a person of color is going to feel those emotions in their day-to-day life. It adds up to something that is more than the sum of all of those parts. And we see that reflected in the outcome. So the outcome data, right? So it's everything from healthcare to the underlying health problems, but it's the provider teams, it's the, and then it's so much more as well, because you can't really quantify a lifetime of those small injuries, a lifetime of those microaggressions, a lifetime of the, what we see in the news almost every day these days, right? Like the trial of the public murder and execution of a Black man has been interrupted by, just down the road, another very public execution, extrajudicial execution of a Black person. So your body is absorbing that trauma your culture, your community, and all of those things. So it has to be addressed from multiple angles. And we're so lucky these days that we have some, what they call the momnibus legislation. And now we have some people who are really focused on these things in power and making them a priority. And I think the more young people who can get involved, like with what we saw in Georgia with Stacey Abrams, and the more young people we can get involved everywhere, it's going to help to start turning the House and the Congress to a younger, more diverse, and people who care more about a wider variety of issues. And when I look at kind of what has gotten funded as research priorities in the last 20 years, they really reflect who you see in Congress, right? So diseases of aging, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, cancer, there's a lot of funding for that kind of stuff and not a lot of funding for maternal health.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like we're going to get to I would love for us to be in charge where, someone says they're pregnant or they're planning a pregnancy, then we have this toolkit and then meals that are delivered that are organic and healthy, because it starts not just at birth, it starts even pre-pregnancy. Like that trimester 0, that's where we need to start getting involved immediately. And everything we talk about in this book is just so important for everyone to know. And much of the burden of raising this awareness has traditionally sat with women of color. And what can we collectively do to change this?
Yeah, so I have a couple of simple actions that I think a lot of people can take. If you're not following these accounts on social media, you cannot see what they're posting and you cannot amplify their message. So a super simple thing to do is go out and follow 5 Black maternal health related accounts and amplify their message, center them in the work that they're doing. It's easy to do on social media. Likes, comments, and shares are the currency, again, that drives the algorithms. And so I can see who are the people who have the most followers, and some of these other accounts could use followers. So let's mobilize our social media army. Let's go out and follow these people. Let's share what they're doing. And that can just alone, it's the kind of thing that you can't buy, right? When somebody, for example, every time the Egg Whisperer likes one of my posts, it brings me so much joy because I'm like, I know that post immediately is going to get more traction on social media because I have, 3,000 followers versus 17 or 20,000 followers. It's immediately helpful to me. So that's one thing we can do. You can read my book, which you can get for 20% off right now using code SPECIAL20 at checkout, and raise this awareness of all of these issues for yourself. And then I want to start seeing these topics being taught more in class and in school. But I also want to see more outreach to start filling the pipeline of scientists and physicians earlier with people who have seen the impact of these problems in their community, and they're going to grow up to be the ones who come into the field and help us solve it.
Do you have anything else you'd like to share about your book or work?
Yeah, so, one of the things I really want to talk about is infertility research and embryonic research. So I field tons of questions on my Instagram account, all about PGT, about embryo glue, about, cycle stimulation medications and what's happening and miscarriage and euploid embryos and all those things, right? And one refrain I hear from people over and over again is, why is this more like an art instead of like a hard science? Why aren't there answers to some of these questions? We should know this. It seems like scientifically we should be able to get to these answers. And I couldn't agree more. But part of the problem is that, research that destroys embryos in the process has been illegal to fund that from the federal government since the 90s. So we are looking at a situation in our country, where 30 years of research the void has been filled by private entities and private interests. Maybe some foundations that can finance this kind of research, and perhaps some state level funding that can finance this kind of research. So here in California, we have the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, and that specifically separately funds embryonic stem cell research. But federal funding, researchers have been unable to attain it. So they can attain funding for everything that happens before conception, but it stops at the embryo itself, and then everything that happens after the embryo gets transferred back. So there's a huge gap. And at the end of the book, I talk about some of these like really cutting edge research. We talk about CRISPRed human embryos, which is genetic engineering for human embryos. We talk about 3-person embryos. So that's an embryo made with the DNA from 3 different people, which it's legal now in the UK, and people's mitochondrial genetic disorders are being resolved through this method of treatment. And I talk about a lot of other things too, like how we can only grow embryos in the lab for 14 days before legally we have to discard them. And then I talk about, chimerism, and there was just a huge research article that came out in the news about making these blastocyst-like structures that were chimeras of monkey cells and human cells. And at first it sounds like this stuff is so Gattaca, right? It's like, oh my gosh, monkey human chimeras, we're going to start having Planet of the Apes. Like, this sounds scary. But the point of doing all of this research is to resolve some of these issues. Like, from the embryo's perspective, what is happening in the embryo that the crosstalk between the embryo and the endometrium is not establishing? So there's repeated miscarriages, right? And if we want to start solving some of these problems or answering some of these questions in IVF about what works and what doesn't work definitively, we need public funding. It needs to be moved out of the sphere of retrospective data. These studies that we rely on are usually retrospective, non-interventional studies, because there can't be a study arm. So that's not gold standard science, right? We want prospective, randomized, controlled clinical trials where there are interventions, and there's double blinding, and there's randomization, and there's treatments for the embryos, and this needs to be funded publicly. I mean, we rely on a few of the private IVF clinics that do a lot of the research, and then they publish it. But they don't have to do that, and who knows how long that funding will last for, and who knows whether that's, there's some conflict of interest there, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
I don't know that we'll see that day in this country, but we might. Do you think we will?
Yeah, I hope so. I hope we will see it in my lifetime.
Where can people find your book and learn more about you?
Okay, so the book publisher is Nova Book Publishers. And if you just Google Thin Pink Line, Regulating Reproduction, there's also a movie out there by the same title, but not Regulating Reproduction, but The Thin Pink Line. You can find it. And then, of course, please use code SPECIAL20 at checkout. I'm also happy, I've been giving some guest lectures for classes, like ethics, college level ethics classes. And, I love coming in as a guest and being able to educate people about these topics. So I'm happy to do a guest lecture. And I'm also, I'm very available on social media, so they can follow ARTCompass IVF on Instagram or ARTCompass app on Twitter. They can find me on LinkedIn. They can Facebook. All the algorithms will help you find me.
I know. When people say, how do I find you? I'm like, just find my name and just message me from anywhere. And that's basically what I'm finding. Literally. Well, thank you, Carol, for coming on. I appreciate you, all the work that you're doing, and I cannot wait to see what's yet to come. And so you're a very special and dear friend of mine, and it's always lovely and awesome to have you on as a guest. So thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Welcome to the Egg Whisperer Show, a program exclusively designed to promote reproductive health awareness and discuss fertility preservation options. Here is your host, the Harvard-educated fertility specialist, Dr. Amy.
She's known as the Egg Whisperer.
Fertility expert Dr. Amy Avazadeh.
And you have yet another success story
Just launched by an East Bay fertility doctor.